As we move westward from the river corridors and northern trade zones, the story shifts, not in truth, but in timing. Contact here comes later, not because these lands were empty or isolated, but because the peoples who lived upon them were self-sufficient, organized, and not immediately entangled in European trade systems. The Central Plains were already complete worlds before outsiders learned how to reach them. Among these nations were the Pawnee, a people of deep intelligence and precision. Their name refers not merely to a tribe, but to a way of understanding existence itself. The Pawnee were not nomads drifting across open land. They were village builders, farmers, and astronomers whose lives were structured around earth and sky working together. Their towns were anchored along rivers such as the Platte, and their ceremonial life followed the movements of the stars. The Pawnee belonged to the Caddoan language family, linking them to ancient societies of the southern plains and river valleys. Long before European maps, their ancestors had already moved, settled, and refined ways of life that balanced agriculture, ceremony, and cosmic order. Their lodges were not placed randomly. Their rituals were not symbolic guesswork. They aligned their world with the heavens because they understood that life on earth is never separate from what moves above it. For this reason, early French trade routes did not pass deeply through Pawnee territory. The Pawnee did not depend on fur economies, nor did they seek out foreign goods to sustain their way of life. As a result, early black contact in the French era is not documented here in the same way it is among the Ojibwe or Cree. This absence is not denial, it is context. Contact follows roots, and roots follow systems. The first black presence to reach Pawnee awareness appears during the early American period. By the early 1800s, as the United States pushed westward, military expeditions and trade caravans began crossing Pawnee lands. It is in this moment that York, the enslaved African man who traveled with the Lewis and Clark expedition, enters the historical record. Even when journals do not describe direct meetings, indigenous nations communicated quickly among themselves. News traveled faster than ink. A black man moving openly with American explorers was noticed, discussed, and remembered. By the 1820s and 1830s, black men appeared more regularly in Pawnee territory, not as settlers, but as part of expanding American systems. Soldiers, wagon drivers, camp laborers, enslaved men attached to officers, guides and interpreters moving along newly imposed routes. Forts such as Fort Atkinson sat directly within Pawnee lands, staffed by racially mixed labor forces that brought black presence into daily visibility. Later still, after the Civil War, contact intensified. The Buffalo Soldiers, black regiments created by the U.S. government, were stationed across the plains. They patrolled, guarded, escorted, and enforced policies they did not design. By this time, the Pawnee were already being displaced, pressured, and confined. Harm came not from a single group, but from a system that used many hands to carry out its will. It must be said plainly, the Pawnee did not encounter black people first as conquerors, nor did black men arrive as free agents shaping policy. They met under the weight of empire, each navigating survival from different positions within the same structure. This does not excuse harm, it explains it. What matters here is timing and truth. Black Pawnee contact is real, documented, and later it unfolds as American expansion tightens its grip on land and life. It is not ancient. It is not mythic. It is historical, human, and heavy with consequence. And still, even here, Allah witnesses every crossing. The Pawnee watched the skies for guidance. Black men looked for safety, dignity, and survival. Both understood that life moves within forces larger than any one people, and that endurance, not domination, is what carries the soul forward. We are now standing at the edge of full American expansion. What comes next is not discovery, it is enforcement. The Buffalo Soldiers and their survival inside empire. By the time the United States began enforcing its vision of the West, the land was no longer being encountered with curiosity. It was being measured, fenced, surveyed, and disciplined. Expansion was not discovery, it was force, and force required bodies willing or desperate enough to carry its weight. Allah allows us to see this clearly. Power does not move on paper alone, it moves through people. This is where the story of the Buffalo Soldiers enters. After the Civil War, black men were declared free in law, but not protected in life. They stepped into a world that had no intention of sheltering them. Lynching, black codes, hunger, and dispossession followed close behind. Survival narrowed until choice itself felt like a trap. Allah knows when a person chooses not from desire, but from necessity, when every path before them carries harm. When the U.S. government authorized black regiments in 1866, it was not mercy. It was need. The same nation that had broken black bodies now clothed them in uniforms and sent them west to enforce borders they did not draw. The uniform offered food, shelter, and a fragile sense of protection, and at the same time bound them to a system that was unraveling indigenous life. Allah sees the contradiction, even when governments refuse to name it. These men did not write policy. They did not decide which lands would be taken or which nations would be confined. Orders descended through ranks, backed by punishment and fear. Refusal did not mean moral freedom. It meant prison, violence, or death. Many enlisted not because they believed, but because survival demanded a body keep breathing. Allah is witness to every intention that never reached the tongue. Here is the truth we must hold without turning away. Buffalo soldiers participated in harm, and they did so inside a structure that offered no clean exit. By the time these regiments were stationed across the plains, indigenous nations, including the Pawnee, had already been weakened by treaty betrayal, starvation, and forced removals. The wound did not begin with black soldiers. It began with federal policy and the slow violence of law. But the presence of black regiments meant that oppressed people were now being used to enforce oppression on others. This is a pattern Allah allows us to recognize across history, because recognition is the first step toward accountability. Black soldiers guarded forts, escorted settlers, protected railroads, and enforced boundaries that cut through indigenous homelands. Their labor secured expansion, not their own liberation. When service ended, many returned to segregation, poverty, and racial terror. Promises dissolved. The uniform did not save them. Allah does not forget promises that humans break. And still, we refuse to flatten these men into villains or saints. They were human beings navigating a world designed to give them no righteous choices. Some carried hope that service would earn dignity. Others carried only exhaustion. All carried weight that history often reduces to footnotes. Allah knows the burden each soul carried beyond what records can hold. Indigenous people, too, were pressed into impossible positions, forced to negotiate, comply, resist, or starve. Some were made scouts. Some were turned against neighboring nations. Survival fractured communities. Empire thrives on fracture. Allah allows us to see this not to despair, but to understand how harm multiplies when power is unchecked. This moment in the story asks us to stay awake, not to excuse, not to accuse blindly, but to bear witness, to see how survival under domination can place oppressed people into roles they never chose, while never mistaking survival for justice. Allah sees every crossing, every compromised choice, every step taken under force. What we have walked through so far is not a single story. It is a layered one. Black presence in North America does not begin in one place, move in one direction, or arrive under one condition. It moves the way people move when history is uneven, through rivers, trade routes, coercion, escape, labor, faith, and endurance. Some arrived early, some arrived later, some were named, many were not. Allah sees them all. It is important to say this clearly. Not all Black ancestry in these lands begins with plantation slavery. Slavery shaped the continent in brutal and lasting ways. But it was not the first contact, nor was it the only condition under which African life existed. Free Africans lived, worked, married, traveled, and adapted long before race hardened into law. Mixed Black Indigenous communities formed before categories were fixed. And still, many lives passed without documentation because power decided what was worth recording. At the same time, we do not romanticize the past. Contact did not always mean harmony. Survival sometimes meant compromise. Harm existed inside Indigenous societies, inside colonial systems, and inside the structures that force people into impossible roles. To acknowledge existence is not to declare innocence. To honor humanity is not to deny wrongdoing. Allah teaches us to hold truth without distortion, neither exaggerating virtue nor hiding violence. This is why we repeat what grounds this entire arc. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Light footprints do not mean empty land. Quiet lives do not mean unimportant lives. People lived fully even when history chose not to look at them closely. And when records thin out, we do not rush to fill the gaps with ego or certainty. We leave space, because leaving space is also a form of respect. What we are doing here is not erasing anyone. We are naming presence where it existed, acknowledging harm where it occurred, and refusing to flatten human life into a single narrative. Africans were here. Indigenous peoples were here. Their worlds crossed under pressure, not conquest by choice. And through it all, Allah remained the constant witness, seeing movement, suffering, adaptation, and survival long before nations claimed authority over memory. What this chapter asks the reader to sit with is not certainty, but honesty. History does not always arrive with names, papers, or clean records. Much of what shaped this land happened through movement, survival, and quiet adaptation. Africans did not only enter North America through plantations and chains. Some arrived earlier, some moved inland through rivers and trade routes, some lived among indigenous nations, and some were never written down at all. Absence of evidence does not erase human presence. It only reveals who had the power to record and who did not. The Black people who appear alongside Spanish and French expeditions were not symbols or footnotes. They were human beings taken from their lands, renamed, repurposed, and pushed into worlds they did not choose. Some endured long enough to guide, to interpret, to survive terrain their captors could not navigate alone. Others disappeared into indigenous communities, built families, or left traces only in oral memory. Their lives were shaped by loss, endurance, and adaptation, not conquest. They did not arrive to dominate land already held by others. They arrived inside systems that were already violent, doing what humans have always done when cornered, finding ways to live. And through all of this, movement, erasure, survival, there is a quiet order that does not belong to empires. Allah knows what is seen and what is hidden. What was recorded and what was swallowed by time are both within His knowledge. Justice is not limited to archives, and truth is not dependent on paperwork. This episode is not here to close questions, but to ground them, to remind us that people mattered even when history refused to remember their names, and that no life passed unseen, even when the world chose not to look.